Florence, 1519. Inside the opulent halls of the Medici palace, the faint cry of a newborn echoed against cold marble walls. That child entered the world surrounded by unimaginable wealth and power, yet within days, she was stripped of the very things that mattered most. Her father, a duke, lay dying of disease. Her mother, a French noblewoman, succumbed to fever after childbirth. By the time the candles marking her baptism had burned out, the infant was already an orphan. Her name was Catherine de Medici. To some, she would later be remembered as the mother of kings. To others, she became the Black Queen of France, a sinister figure whispered about in tales of poison, witchcraft, and massacre. But long before those legends were born, she was just a fragile girl carrying the heavy burden of survival, an heir not only to the Medici fortune, but also to the dangerous ambitions of Europe's most ruthless power brokers. This is not a tale of a beloved queen adored by her people. It is the story of a woman mocked, humiliated, and sidelined, yet who endured every blow and learned to wield silence as a weapon. From a child threatened with death in Florence, to a wife overshadowed by her husband's mistress, to the widow cloaked in black who would hold France in her grasp, Catherine's life was nothing less than a battle between survival and destruction. And so, when history asks whether she was a mother defending her dynasty or a cold architect of bloodshed, the truth may be far more complex. This is her story. The story of Catherine de Medici begins with silence, the kind of silence that follows loss so devastating that words seem powerless. Florence, in the spring of 1519, should have celebrated the birth of a new Medici heir with bells and fireworks. Instead, within days of Catherine's first cry, death swept through the palace halls like an uninvited guest. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour, weakened after childbirth, never recovered. Fever consumed her before she could even hold her daughter properly. And her father, Lorenzo II, Duke of Urbino, already ravaged by illness, followed her soon after. The grand palaces of Florence held priceless art, marble staircases, and libraries brimming with wisdom. But for the infant Catherine, they became the loneliest of prisons. Before she could even recognize her parents' faces, she was left to the mercy of relatives and guardians who saw her less as a child and more as a symbol, a fragile vessel carrying both the wealth and the destiny of the Medici name. She was too young to understand it, but her life had already become a battlefield. In Renaissance Europe, a girl like Catherine was not a daughter to be cherished, she was a pawn to be placed carefully on the board of politics. Her inheritance made her both a prize and a liability. Nobles whispered about her fortune, papal envoys calculated alliances, and enemies of the Medici watched with sharpened daggers, waiting for an opportunity. In those early years, Catherine was taken into the care of her grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini. Alfonsina was a stern matriarch, a woman of iron will who carried herself as if she, too, had been born to rule. Under her watch, Catherine's infancy was sheltered but never soft. Alfonsina saw in the child the future of the Medici line, and she made sure Catherine's survival came before sentiment. Yet fate was merciless once again. By 1520, when Catherine was barely 1 year old, Alfonsina herself passed away. Once again, the little girl was uprooted, carried from one household to another, her future discussed more often in council chambers than in family dining halls. Eventually, she was placed in a convent at Le Murade in Florence. To many, a convent meant seclusion, but for Catherine, it was the first place where she found stability. The nuns there were not just caretakers, they were educators. They gave her not only shelter but also discipline and, more importantly, an education rare for girls of her time. While many noble daughters learned only embroidery, manners, and piety, Catherine was taught to read and write fluently in several languages, to study mathematics, and to grasp the patterns of the heavens in astronomy. Even as a child, she was curious, absorbing knowledge not out of duty but out of hunger. She loved literature, memorized passages of ancient texts, and took special interest in practical arts like cooking and the distillation of perfumes. These were not idle pastimes. To her, they were experiments, glimpses into a world where nature could be transformed, controlled, even weaponized. Nobody then could have imagined how much this seemingly innocent fascination would shape her future reputation as a queen rumored to wield poisons in delicate bottles of scent. Yet her childhood was anything but peaceful. Outside the convent walls, Italy was a powder keg. The Medici family's power, though immense, was unstable. Rivals loomed in every corner, Republicans in Florence who hated Medici rule, powerful Italian states with their own ambitions, and foreign powers like France and the Holy Roman Empire who treated the peninsula as a chessboard. Catherine, though just a girl, carried the Medici name like a brand on her skin. It made her valuable, but also dangerously vulnerable. This vulnerability became terrifyingly real in 1527, when Catherine was 8 years old. That year, Europe was shaken by the infamous sack of Rome. Imperial troops under Emperor Charles V stormed the city, pillaging and murdering with brutal abandon. Pope Clement VII, Catherine's uncle and protector, was taken prisoner. Florence seized the chance to revolt against Medici rule. For Catherine, it was a nightmare. She, the little girl who had spent her early years learning prayers and reciting poetry, suddenly became a hostage in the hands of rebels who despised her bloodline. To humiliate the Medici, they threatened unspeakable cruelties. Some suggested parading her naked through the streets. Others plotted to place her in a basket atop the city walls, to serve as living target practice for enemy cannons. Imagine the terror of an 8-year-old, too young to comprehend politics but old enough to feel fear burn in her chest. And yet, witnesses claimed Catherine endured it in silence. She did not scream. She did not beg. In that silence, her innocence was stripped away, replaced by something harder, sharper. A child should not have to learn the art of calculation, but Catherine did. From then on, she would carry inside her a survival instinct, an awareness that in a world of wolves, showing fear was the first step toward being devoured. Her captivity did not last forever. When the Medici regained power, Pope Clement ensured her release. But by then, Catherine was no longer the same girl. The ordeal had left a permanent mark. She had looked into the abyss of human cruelty and realized that her only true shield was her mind. Clement, recognizing both her vulnerability and her value, decided her destiny must be secured not in Florence but in a greater stage, France. Marriage, in Renaissance Europe, was the strongest chain of alliance, and Clement needed a bond powerful enough to protect his niece. France, under King Francis I, sought deeper influence in Italy. A union between the Medici and the French royal family would serve both sides. For Catherine, it meant being uprooted once again, carried across borders not as a child but as a bride-to-be. She had spent her early life wandering between convents and palaces, between terror and shelter, between hope and despair. Now she was being thrust into a future she could not choose. But if her childhood had taught her anything, it was that choices were a luxury. Survival, adaptation, and patience, that was the true path. Catherine de Medici entered adolescence already shaped by fire. Orphaned at birth, threatened with humiliation, and molded by loss, she had learned to guard her emotions behind a mask, to wait when others acted rashly, and to absorb knowledge when others wasted time. These were not traits of a typical noble girl. They were the tools of a survivor. And as her carriage rolled toward the destiny waiting in France, Catherine could not have known that the lessons of her childhood, the silence, the patience, the hunger for knowledge, would become the very weapons that allowed her not only to endure but to one day command the fate of kings. Catherine's release from captivity did not mean freedom. It meant exchange. She was no longer a child held hostage by Florentine rebels, but she had become something even more valuable, a political piece to be moved on Europe's great chessboard. And it was her uncle, Pope Clement VII, who now held the hand that would make the move. Clement was a man as shrewd as he was cautious. He understood that the Medici name could only survive if it was anchored to greater powers. Florence was small, fragile against the ambitions of empires. France, however, was mighty. King Francis I was one of the most powerful rulers of his age, cultured, ambitious, eager to strengthen his hand in Italy. For Clement, an alliance with the French crown was more than convenient, it was essential. Catherine, still just a girl, had no say in the matter. But she must have sensed the weight of the decision. She had lived long enough to know that her life was not her own, it belonged to her family's legacy. By 1533, at the age of 14, she was escorted across the Alps, her carriage bearing her from the convent walls of Florence to the glittering, dangerous court of France. The French nobility had heard of her. They knew she was Medici, wealthy, yes, but of merchant blood. To them, Florence was a city of bankers, not of kings. Whispers filled the air before she even set foot in Marseille, a shopkeeper's daughter, nothing more. Catherine carried that sting with her, but she had also learned the art of silence. She arrived not with loud boasts or extravagant gestures, but with quiet dignity. The marriage was arranged to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of Francis I. He was a boy of 14, awkward, uncertain, scarred by years of captivity in Spain as a hostage for his father's wars. His release had left him free in body but bound in soul to a woman who would forever stand between him and his new bride, Diane de Poitiers. The wedding itself was magnificent. Marseille glowed with pageantry as Pope Clement himself traveled from Rome to officiate. Processions, feasts, music, jewels, Catherine, dressed in silks and embroidery, seemed like the embodiment of Medici wealth. Yet behind the gilded veil lay disappointment. For Francis I, who had hoped Catherine's dowry would include vast Italian territories, the gifts of gold and jewels felt insufficient. From the very beginning, Catherine entered France not as a celebrated princess, but as a compromise. Her humiliation began on the wedding night. Catherine, nervous yet dutiful, waited for her husband. But Henry did not come to her bed with affection. He went instead to Diane, 20 years his senior, elegant, commanding, and already enthroned in his heart. Catherine knew immediately what this meant. The bond she was meant to forge was already broken. Her first night as a wife ended in silence, with her husband's rejection echoing louder than any words. The French court, famous for its cruelty, wasted no time exploiting this wound. They mocked her accent, ridiculed her origins, and whispered the nickname that would haunt her for years, the little Florentine shopkeeper. For a girl barely 14, it was a dagger to the spirit. And yet, Francis I, her father-in-law, saw something more. Unlike his courtiers, he recognized Catherine's intelligence and composure. She was not dazzling in beauty, nor commanding in presence, but she carried herself with a dignity that intrigued him. He offered her protection, a small shield against the venom of the court. Under his gaze, Catherine found a chance to adapt. Adaptation became her weapon. She studied the French tongue until she could speak it with precision. She immersed herself in the history, politics, and customs of her new home. She observed the dances, the rituals, the endless games of intrigue, and she learned to play them, not with flamboyance, but with subtlety. Catherine understood that to survive, she could not fight openly. She must endure, watch, and wait. Still, the shadow of Diane loomed over every step. Diane was not just Henry's mistress, she was his guide, his confidant, his anchor. The older woman had shaped him since he was 12, after his release from Spain. She dressed in black and white, the colors of mourning, yet carried herself with an allure that captivated Henry entirely. To Catherine, every palace wall seemed to bear witness to this bond. She could not escape it. Even the symbols of her humiliation were carved in stone. Henry and Diane's initials, H and D, were entwined across chateaux, fountains, and palaces. Some tried to comfort Catherine by suggesting the symbol could also be read as an intertwined H and C, for Henry and Catherine. But Catherine knew better. She was living in the shadow of another woman's triumph. The one thing that could have secured her position was a child. A queen consort without heirs was always vulnerable. And for 10 long years, Catherine bore none. Each passing year deepened the whispers. Perhaps she was barren. Perhaps Henry would seek annulment. Perhaps the little Florentine would be cast aside. The pressure was relentless. She prayed, consulted doctors, clung to hope. But every month, disappointment returned. Her uncle Clement VII, the one man who had championed her, died in 1534. Without him, her shield weakened. The French court grew restless. For Catherine, it was another lesson in survival: she must not despair. And then, in 1544, her prayers were answered. Catherine gave birth to her first son, Francis. The court that had mocked her now fell silent. She had proven herself, if only for a moment. Over the years, she would give birth to 9 more children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood. In an age when infant mortality claimed many, this was no small feat. Among those children were future kings, Francis II, Charles IX, Henry III, and daughters who would marry into European thrones. But even as she fulfilled her duty as mother, her personal life remained barren of affection. Henry's love belonged entirely to Diane, and Catherine's triumphs were always muted by that reality. When Henry's elder brother, Francis, Duke of Brittany, died in 1536, Henry became heir to the French throne. With that, Catherine's role became even more vital. Yet her heart remained in shadow, her marriage a union of politics without love. In the corridors of the French court, Catherine's figure was quiet, almost overlooked. She was not the radiant mistress, nor the bold courtier. She was the silent observer, absorbing everything. To her enemies, she seemed powerless. To Catherine herself, she was building an arsenal, not of swords, but of knowledge, patience, and endurance. Her life in France had begun in humiliation, rejection, and ridicule. But Catherine de Medici had learned long ago that survival was not about immediate victories. It was about enduring long enough for opportunities to arise. And as she raised her children, mastered the language of her new country, and quietly molded herself into a figure of resilience, she was preparing for the day when fate would at last turn its gaze toward her. That day would come sooner than anyone expected. For Catherine, the years that followed her marriage were defined by silence. Not the peaceful silence of convent halls, but the heavy silence of absence, absence of affection, absence of recognition, absence of love. She was Henry's wife in title, but in his heart she was nothing more than a shadow. Henry's devotion to Diane de Poitiers became the unspoken truth of the French court. Everyone knew it, and everyone played their part. When Henry rode into tournaments, it was Diane who wore his colors. When he received gifts of honor, it was Diane who accepted them on his behalf. Catherine, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines, her place as wife reduced to little more than ceremony. Still, she endured. She had endured humiliation before. What was the sneer of courtiers compared to the memory of rebels threatening to hurl her from Florence's walls? Catherine had long ago learned the power of endurance. She would not lash out, she would not collapse. She would survive. Yet her survival was tested in the most personal way, through the question of children. For a decade, Catherine bore none. Each passing year weighed heavily on her shoulders. In the 16th century, a queen without heirs was like a tree without fruit. Her worth was measured by the cradle, not by her character. The whispers grew crueler. Barren, they said. Some suggested annulment. Others whispered that Henry would set her aside, replace her with a bride more fertile, more worthy. In a world where marriage was nothing more than strategy, Catherine knew her place was precarious. Without children, she was dispensable. Desperate, she turned to remedies and prayers. Physicians offered her strange potions, astrologers gave hopeful predictions, and Catherine clung to each with the resolve of someone fighting for her life. She even turned to charms and rituals whispered in Florence, practices that later fed the rumors of sorcery that would cling to her name. But she did not give up. She prayed in chapels, fasted, and waited. Her patience, once again, proved to be her strength. In 1544, at the age of 25, Catherine finally gave birth to her first child, a boy named Francis. The court, which had long mocked her, fell silent. She had delivered the heir that secured her place. From that moment forward, Catherine became not only wife but mother. Between 1544 and 1556, she bore 10 children, 7 of whom survived infancy. In that, she achieved what few women of her age could. Her sons, Francis, Charles, and Henry, would all one day wear the French crown. Her daughters would marry into thrones of Europe, becoming queens of Spain, of Lorraine, of Navarre. Yet even as she fulfilled her duty, Catherine remained unloved. Henry's heart belonged fully to Diane. The older woman wielded extraordinary influence, not only over Henry but also over the kingdom itself. She was given titles, wealth, even the magnificent Château de Chenonceau, one of the jewels of the Loire Valley. Everywhere Catherine turned, she saw the initials H and D entwined, carved into stone and wood, mocking her invisibility. Some told her the design could be read as H and C, for Henry and Catherine. But Catherine knew it was a lie. When Francis I died in 1547 and Henry ascended the throne as Henry II, Catherine became Queen Consort of France. But the crown brought her no more respect than she had known before. Diane de Poitiers was now not only the king's mistress but also the most powerful woman in France. She advised Henry on matters of state, signed official documents, and appeared beside him in ceremonies where the queen herself should have stood. Catherine was queen by law, but Diane was queen in everything else. In public, Catherine remained composed. She wore her gowns with dignity, performed her duties at court, and raised her children with devotion. In private, however, she turned inward. She sought solace in study, of astrology, of medicine, of alchemy. She filled her hours not with jealousy but with observation, watching how power moved, how men and women bent it to their will. She built friendships with scholars, corresponded with thinkers, and even began to consult the mysterious seer Nostradamus, who foretold that her sons would rule as kings. His words comforted her, though she knew too well how fragile prophecy could be. She also began to experiment. In hidden chambers, Catherine mixed herbs, perfumes, and tinctures. Some were meant for beauty, others for healing. Still others carried darker possibilities. To Catherine, this was not sorcery but knowledge. Florence had taught her that everything, plants, minerals, even stars, could be studied, understood, controlled. Yet to those who watched from the outside, it was easy to whisper, "The Italian queen plays with poisons." For Catherine, knowledge was not a hobby, it was a weapon in preparation. She had no armies, no lover to defend her, no throne of her own. What she had was patience, memory, and a mind sharpened by years of exclusion. She watched as Diane reveled in triumph, as Henry lavished her with gifts, as courtiers bowed before her. And Catherine remained silent. But her silence was not weakness. It was survival. Then fate intervened. On June 30, 1559, during a tournament in Paris, King Henry II faced Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of his guard. It was meant to be sport, a spectacle to celebrate the marriage of Catherine's daughter, Elizabeth, to Philip II of Spain. But in an instant, joy turned to horror. Montgomery's lance splintered, a shard driving through Henry's visor and into his eye. For 10 days, Henry lay dying in agony. Catherine remained at his side, her presence constant and unwavering. Diane, the woman who had ruled his heart for decades, was nowhere to be found. At last, on July 10, Henry II died. After 26 years of humiliation, rejection, and invisibility, Catherine's world shifted. She was no longer the overlooked wife. She was now the Queen Mother. Her eldest son, Francis, was only 15, too young, too frail to rule alone. And so, for the first time in her life, Catherine's silence ended. She acted swiftly, decisively. Diane was banished from court, stripped of her jewels, forced to surrender the Château de Chenonceau. Catherine herself took possession of the residence, turning it into one of her favorite homes. From that moment forward, she dressed only in black, adopting mourning as her permanent attire. To the world, she was a widow cloaked in sorrow. But beneath the black fabric, Catherine was something else entirely, a woman stepping out of the shadows, ready to rule. Her patience had finally paid off. Decades of endurance had forged her into steel. She had been the orphan, the hostage, the humiliated wife, the barren queen. But now, Catherine de Medici was the mother of a king. And that meant power. When the bells of Paris tolled for Henry II's death in July 1559, they did not simply announce the end of a king, they rang in the rise of Catherine de Medici. For 26 years she had lived in silence, overshadowed by Diane de Poitiers, mocked by courtiers, dismissed as insignificant. Now, dressed in unbroken black, Catherine emerged from the shadows. Her eldest son, Francis II, was only 15. Frail in body, timid in spirit, he was ill-prepared to rule a kingdom riven by tension. But Catherine knew her time had come. She moved quickly, her first act a symbolic strike. Diane was banished from court. The jewels, titles, and the glittering Château de Chenonceau that had long mocked Catherine's humiliation were stripped away and claimed by the Queen Mother herself. In one gesture, decades of insult were erased. Catherine, once invisible, was now indisputably present. But presence was not the same as power. The French throne, though held by her son, was not hers to command. The court was dominated by the powerful Guise brothers, Francis, Duke of Guise, and Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, staunch Catholics and unyielding in their ambition. They quickly wrapped young Francis II in their grip, guiding his every decision, isolating him from his mother's influence. Catherine, who had waited so long to reach this moment, found herself once more pushed to the side. It might have broken another woman. But Catherine had endured worse. She understood now that power was never handed freely. It had to be taken, not in a single dramatic stroke, but slowly, patiently, like water wearing down stone. So she waited again. She watched the Guises, studied their strengths, their weaknesses, their enemies. The kingdom itself was cracking under the weight of religious conflict. The Protestant Huguenots were growing bolder, demanding recognition, while the Catholic hardliners sought to stamp them out. France was on the edge of civil war, and Catherine knew that chaos could either destroy her, or create opportunity. That opportunity came sooner than she might have hoped. In December 1560, after only 17 months on the throne, Francis II died suddenly from an ear infection that spread into meningitis. He was just 16 years old. Mary, Queen of Scots, his young wife and the niece of the Guise brothers, was left widowed, and the Guise grip on the throne crumbled with him. In that moment, Catherine stepped fully into her role as regent. Her second son, Charles IX, was only 10 years old. A child king required a guiding hand, and Catherine positioned herself to be that hand. She moved swiftly to consolidate her authority, appointing the moderate humanist Michel de l'Hospital as Chancellor of France. Unlike the Guises, who sought only dominance, de l'Hospital shared Catherine's vision of balance. He believed, as she did, that the monarchy must stand above religious division, not be consumed by it. Catherine's black garments became her uniform, a constant reminder to the world of her widowhood and her authority as Queen Mother. But mourning was not weakness. It was armor. Behind the somber veil, she exercised a shrewd and steady hand. She understood that France was bleeding from within. To preserve the throne for her children, she needed to navigate the dangerous currents of faith with caution. In 1561, she attempted what few rulers had dared, reconciliation. She organized the Colloquy of Poissy, a meeting of Catholic and Protestant theologians, hoping that dialogue might bridge the divide tearing France apart. The effort failed, neither side willing to bend, each accusing the other of heresy. But the attempt revealed Catherine's strategy. She was less interested in dogma than in survival. She would bend, she would compromise, she would shift, so long as the monarchy endured. Her pragmatism culminated in January 1562, when she issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, granting limited tolerance to the Huguenots. It was a daring move, one that enraged Catholic hardliners but offered hope for peace. Catherine must have known how precarious her path was. Too lenient, and the Catholics would brand her a traitor. Too harsh, and the Protestants would revolt. But to Catherine, the calculation was simple: her sons' crowns were worth any risk. Her gamble, however, collapsed in March of that year. In the town of Vassy, the Duke of Guise and his men attacked a congregation of Huguenots at worship. Dozens were slaughtered, their cries echoing across France. The massacre ignited the first of 8 wars of religion, plunging the kingdom into decades of bloodshed. For Catherine, it was a brutal lesson: words and edicts meant little against the fury of zealotry. The middle path she sought was perhaps the hardest of all, for in trying to balance both sides, she won the trust of neither. Catholics accused her of softness. Protestants doubted her sincerity. She stood between 2 fires, and both threatened to consume her. Yet even amid the flames, Catherine persisted. She arranged marriages to build alliances. Her daughter Elizabeth married Philip II of Spain, binding France to Catholic power. Her daughter Claude married into Lorraine, strengthening ties to another Catholic house, and later, Margaret would be betrothed to Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who would one day become Henry IV. Each union was a calculated move, a piece placed on the board to stabilize the crown. At the same time, Catherine understood the importance of image. From 1564 to 1566, she and young Charles IX embarked on the Grand Tour of France, a procession of festivals, tournaments, and spectacles designed not only to entertain but to remind the people of the majesty of their monarchy. She introduced elaborate court ballets, pageants where art and politics intertwined, each performance reinforcing the idea that despite division, the crown still stood strong. But beneath the glitter of dances and parades, Catherine's darker pursuits continued. At Blois, she maintained her secret laboratory, experimenting with herbs, minerals, and potions. She surrounded herself with astrologers and alchemists, including her confidant Cosimo Ruggieri. She still consulted Nostradamus, whose prophecies fed her sense of destiny. These fascinations would fuel the legends that painted her as a sorceress, the Italian queen who ruled through poison and witchcraft. To her enemies, it was proof of her unnatural influence. To Catherine, it was knowledge that meant survival. All the while, Charles IX grew under her watchful eye. He was volatile, given to sudden rages and deep melancholy. Catherine, ever the strategist, kept him close, managing his moods with hunts, physical exertion, and constant supervision. She ensured he trusted no one more than her. It was not maternal affection alone, it was political necessity. If her son was weak, then her strength must fill the void. By now, Catherine's transformation was complete. No longer the silent bride mocked as the little Florentine shopkeeper, she had become the widow in black, the mother of kings, the regent who held France together with a will forged in fire. Yet the fires of religion still burned hotter by the day, and Catherine knew that the tightrope she walked could snap at any moment. The woman who had been orphan, hostage, and humiliated wife was now ruler in all but name. But her greatest test, the moment that would brand her forever in history's memory, was still to come. Catherine de Medici's regency began with a vision of balance. She believed, or at least hoped, that compromise could hold a fractured kingdom together. She was Catholic, raised in a church that shaped her entire life, but she was also a pragmatist. What mattered to her was not doctrine, it was survival, for her children and for the monarchy. Her son Charles IX was only 10 years old when he became king in 1560. Too young to lead, too fragile to command, he leaned heavily on his mother. Catherine seized the opportunity. She positioned herself as the center of power, surrounding Charles with loyal advisors and placing herself firmly between the rival factions threatening to tear France apart. On one side stood the Catholic Guise family, fiery and uncompromising, demanding the eradication of heresy. On the other stood the Huguenots, the growing Protestant minority inspired by Calvin, many of them powerful nobles themselves, led by figures like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny and the Bourbon princes. Catherine sought a middle road. She reached for dialogue, hosting the Colloquy of Poissy in 1561, where Catholic and Protestant theologians debated under the vaulted ceilings of a monastery. She hoped reason might triumph where swords threatened. But the effort collapsed. The gap was too wide, the passions too fierce. The Catholics declared Protestant beliefs heretical, the Protestants refused to yield. Catherine, watching the debate disintegrate, must have realized how impossible her role truly was. Still, she pressed on. In January 1562, she issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, granting limited rights to the Huguenots, allowing them to worship outside city walls. To Catherine, it was a gesture of tolerance, a chance to calm the storm. To the Catholics, it was betrayal. The test came swiftly. In March 1562, the massacre of Vassy shattered her fragile peace. François, Duke of Guise, and his men attacked a congregation of Protestants at worship. Dozens were cut down, their bodies left broken in the streets. Word spread like wildfire. The Protestants rose in arms, the Catholics rallied to their banners, and the first of 8 wars of religion began. France was drenched in blood. Cities burned, villages were ravaged, neighbors turned against each other. For Catherine, it was the nightmare she had tried to prevent. She was forced to navigate a kingdom at war with itself, shifting constantly between factions. To one side, she promised firmness, to the other, leniency. Her critics accused her of duplicity, of playing both ends against the middle. Perhaps she did. But in truth, she had no choice. She had 3 goals: keep her son on the throne, preserve the monarchy, and prevent total collapse. She turned to marriage diplomacy as a weapon. Her daughter Elizabeth was wed to Philip II of Spain, cementing ties with Catholic power. Claude, another daughter, married Charles III, Duke of Lorraine, again binding the crown to Catholic allies. But Catherine also looked toward the Protestants. She arranged the betrothal of her daughter Margaret to Henry of Navarre, the young Bourbon prince and leader of the Huguenot cause. The marriage, she hoped, would stitch together the torn fabric of France. At the same time, Catherine understood the theater of power. She knew that France, bleeding and weary, needed to see its monarchy not as fragile but as majestic. Between 1564 and 1566, she and Charles IX embarked on a grand tour of France, traveling through towns and provinces with parades, festivals, and tournaments. It was not frivolity, it was propaganda. The people needed to see their king, young though he was, alive and strong. Catherine orchestrated ballets, elaborate pageants where myth and politics intertwined, designed to awe the crowds and remind them that the crown still stood above the chaos. But behind the glitter, Catherine's darker fascinations endured. At Blois, she maintained her laboratory, experimenting with perfumes, remedies, and poisons. She surrounded herself with astrologers and alchemists. To her supporters, she was curious, intellectually restless, a woman ahead of her time. To her enemies, she was the Black Queen, a sorceress whose perfumes killed and whose stars dictated policy. Rumors of witchcraft clung to her like smoke. She ignored them. Let them whisper. Whispers could not shake her as long as her sons wore crowns. Charles IX, however, was a fragile anchor. As he grew older, his temperament darkened. He was prone to violent fits of rage, followed by deep, paralyzing melancholy. Catherine managed him carefully, keeping him close, guiding his every step. She filled his days with hunts and sport, exhausting him physically so that she could manage affairs of state herself. She made sure he trusted her above all others. It was both maternal protection and political necessity. A weak king could not survive without her, and she ensured he never would. Still, danger came from those who gained Charles's ear. Chief among them was Admiral Coligny, leader of the Huguenots. Coligny won the king's trust with his talk of war against Spain, urging France to aid Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. To Catherine, this was disastrous. A war against Spain could destroy France. Worse, it threatened to pull her son into the Huguenot camp, away from her own influence. For a brief moment, it seemed peace might be possible. The Peace of Saint-Germain in 1570 granted the Huguenots significant concessions, including fortified towns where they could worship freely. To seal the peace, Catherine arranged the marriage of her daughter Margaret to Henry of Navarre, leader of the Protestant faction. It was a daring gamble, uniting Catholic and Protestant blood in one royal wedding. In August 1572, Paris prepared for the grand celebration. Nobles from both sides gathered, uneasy but hopeful, convinced that this union might heal the kingdom. For Catherine, it was the culmination of years of maneuvering, proof that balance might yet be restored. But beneath the surface, tension boiled. The fragile peace trembled on the edge of collapse. Catherine, watching the festivities unfold, must have felt both relief and dread. She had survived Florence, humiliation in France, and the first flames of civil war. But what was coming would test her like nothing before. Because the wedding meant not reconciliation, but slaughter. And the widow in black, who had built her life on silence and survival, would soon be remembered forever as the queen whose name was tied to one of the darkest massacres in European history. In August 1572, Paris glittered with banners, music, and the promise of reconciliation. The long-awaited marriage between Margaret de Valois, Catherine's youngest daughter, and Henry of Navarre, the Protestant leader of the Bourbon line, was heralded as a union that might heal France. For Catherine, who had labored for years to balance between Catholics and Huguenots, the wedding was both a gamble and a hope. If anything could stitch together the torn fabric of her kingdom, it was this. The city swelled with nobles, Catholic and Protestant alike. For days, celebrations filled the streets. Processions wound through the cobbled avenues, church bells rang, and feasts overflowed with wine and laughter. Yet beneath the glitter, unease simmered. The Parisians, deeply Catholic, muttered their disapproval at the influx of Protestant lords. The tension was like a string pulled taut, beautiful on the surface but one tug away from snapping. On August 22, the string snapped. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Huguenot leader who had become a trusted counselor to King Charles IX, was ambushed in the streets of Paris. A musket ball tore through his hand and arm, nearly killing him. The assassin escaped. Suspicion immediately fell on the Guise family, bitter enemies of Coligny. But whispers spread just as quickly that Catherine herself had orchestrated the attempt. After all, Coligny's influence over Charles threatened her carefully maintained control. He urged the king toward war against Spain, an adventure Catherine feared would destroy France. Was the Queen Mother behind the shot? The truth was never proven. But the rumor clung to her like smoke. Coligny survived, and the Huguenot nobles, already uneasy in Catholic Paris, demanded justice. They gathered around the wounded admiral, their anger simmering. Charles IX, shaken, visited Coligny and promised retribution. For a moment, the Huguenots believed the king was with them. Catherine must have felt the balance slipping from her hands. Her son, impressionable and volatile, was drawn to Coligny's cause. She feared that France would be dragged into a disastrous war against Spain, guided by a Protestant admiral. Worse, she feared losing her hold over her son. On the night of August 23, Catherine convened a secret council at the Tuileries Palace. Behind closed doors, she and her advisers weighed their options. The danger was real. The Huguenot nobles, gathered in Paris for the wedding, were concentrated, powerful, and angry. If they rebelled, the crown might not withstand the blow. Catherine and the council faced a brutal choice: strike first, or risk being struck. In the early hours of August 24, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day, the decision was made. Soldiers surrounded the lodging of Admiral Coligny. He was dragged from his bed, stabbed, and hurled from a window. His body, broken and bloodied, was desecrated in the streets. The spark became wildfire. Paris erupted. Bells rang, not in celebration but in alarm. Catholic mobs surged through the city, fueled by fear, hatred, and vengeance. They broke into houses where Huguenots lodged, dragged men from their beds, slaughtered women and children alike. Bodies filled the Seine, blood ran through the narrow streets. The massacre spread with horrifying speed, the violence unrelenting. For 3 days, Paris drowned in blood. And then it spread outward, beyond the capital, into the towns and countryside. From Rouen to Lyon, from Bordeaux to Toulouse, the killings echoed. Estimates vary, but between 5,000 and 30,000 Protestants perished in the slaughter. Where was Catherine? Some chronicles paint her as the architect, the cold instigator who demanded the blood of her enemies. Others argue she intended only a targeted strike against Coligny and a handful of Huguenot leaders, but the violence spiraled beyond her control. The truth is lost in shadow. What is certain is that Catherine showed no outward grief, no public hesitation. To some, she embodied cold calculation, preserving her son's throne at the price of her kingdom's soul. Charles IX himself was shattered. At first, he seemed complicit. Eyewitnesses claimed he fired a musket from the Louvre at fleeing Protestants. But afterward, the horror consumed him. He suffered nightmares of rivers running red, of screams echoing endlessly in his ears. The young king's already fragile health deteriorated rapidly, eaten by guilt and tuberculosis. He was only 23 when he died in May 1574, whispering to his childhood nurse, "How much blood, how many murders, what evil counsel I have followed. Lord God, forgive me." For Catherine, the massacre was both triumph and curse. It removed Coligny and weakened the Huguenot leadership, securing her son's immediate throne. But it also blackened her name forever. Across Europe, she was denounced as the Black Queen, the Italian poisoner who cloaked herself in witchcraft and ordered the slaughter of innocents. Even among her allies, suspicion grew. To the Catholics, she was too cautious, never zealous enough. To the Protestants, she was a monster. She had tried to balance between two fires, but now both burned against her. Yet Catherine did what she had always done, she endured. With Charles IX gone, her next son, Henry of Anjou, was summoned from Poland, where he briefly reigned as king, to take the French throne as Henry III. Catherine, once again, was the mother of a king. Her influence remained vast, though her reputation was stained beyond repair. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre would define her in history, casting a shadow over every act she took thereafter. But for Catherine herself, it was not reputation that mattered. It was survival. She had kept her son on the throne. France was still a monarchy. The Medici blood still sat upon the crown. The widow in black had secured her dynasty, at a price written in blood. When Charles IX died in 1574, the crown passed once more to another of Catherine's sons, Henry, Duke of Anjou, who returned from Poland to reign as Henry III of France. For Catherine, it was a familiar transformation, widow, mother, regent, counselor, always shifting her role to match the fragile throne her children inherited. By now, she had lived long enough to see 3 of her sons were the crown, but the kingdom they ruled was a fractured one, scarred by wars of faith and betrayal. Henry III was not like his brothers. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply attached to his mother. He shared her fascination with philosophy, art, and even the occult. But he was also erratic. He dressed flamboyantly, surrounded himself with handsome courtiers known as his mignons, and veered from extreme piety to reckless indulgence. For Catherine, this new reign was both a triumph and a torment. She wielded influence as queen mother, but she watched with growing alarm as her son alienated nobles and commoners alike. Outside the court, the kingdom descended deeper into chaos. The Catholic League, led by the formidable Henry of Guise, rose in power, vowing to exterminate Protestantism once and for all. At the same time, the Protestant cause endured under Henry of Navarre, Catherine's own son-in-law. The marriage that was meant to reconcile France had instead become another battlefield. The nation fractured into factions, each more determined than the last. Catherine, now in her 50s and then 60s, did not rest. Despite failing health, she traveled tirelessly across the kingdom, negotiating, cajoling, and pleading for moderation. She met Henry of Navarre in person, urging him to convert to Catholicism, hoping to avert further war. But he refused. Catherine, though weary, pressed on. Her role was no longer to shape her children alone but to hold together the very idea of monarchy. Yet time was slipping from her grasp. In May 1588, Paris erupted in revolt against Henry III, a moment known as the Day of the Barricades. Citizens rose in fury, barricading the streets, forcing the king to flee the capital. Catherine, bedridden with illness, could only watch as her son's authority crumbled. Desperate to regain control, Henry III turned to violence. In December 1588, at the Château de Blois, he lured Henry of Guise into his chamber and had him assassinated, followed swiftly by the killing of the cardinal, Guise's brother. When the news reached Catherine, she is said to have sighed with weary resignation, "You have cut, my son. Now you must sow." It was her last piece of counsel. She knew that murder would not restore stability. It would only invite vengeance. On January 5, 1589, Catherine de Medici died at the age of 69. Pneumonia claimed her body, but grief and exhaustion had already claimed her spirit. She had lived through more turmoil than most could imagine, born into loss, threatened with death as a child, humiliated as a wife, and vilified as a queen. Yet through it all, she had endured. She had kept her sons on the throne, even as the monarchy itself trembled. Her funeral was modest, rushed, lacking the grandeur that had accompanied the burials of kings. France was too consumed by civil war to honor her properly. She was laid to rest at Saint Denis, among the kings of France, but without the splendor befitting the woman who had ruled, if not always in name, for nearly 3 decades. 7 months later, her last surviving son, Henry III, was assassinated by a fanatical monk. With his death, the Valois dynasty ended. The crown passed to Henry of Navarre, the Protestant who became Henry IV of France. In an act of pragmatism that Catherine herself might have admired, he converted to Catholicism, declaring, "Paris is well worth a mass." He went on to restore stability to France, bringing peace where Catherine had only managed survival. History judged Catherine harshly. To her enemies, she was the Black Queen, the Italian poisoner, a Jezebel who cloaked herself in sorcery and blood. To Protestant chroniclers, she was the mastermind of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. To Catholic zealots, she was too lenient, too willing to compromise. Rarely was she praised, and even more rarely was she loved. And yet, her cultural legacy was undeniable. Catherine brought Italian refinements to France, introducing the fork at court dining tables, perfumes that became symbols of elegance, and culinary traditions that reshaped French cuisine. She commissioned the Tuileries Palace, nurtured the arts, and laid the groundwork for French classical ballet. Her patronage left behind not only a dynasty of rulers but also a nation reshaped by her taste and ambition. More than anything, Catherine de Medici embodied survival. She lived through the death of her parents, the scorn of her husband, the shadow of her rival, and the fury of religious war. She was never adored, but she was always necessary. Her motto captured her essence, odio et amo, I hate and I love. Love for her children, hatred for those who mocked her. Duty above affection. Calculation above impulse. When we look at her portraits today, we see a woman draped in black, her eyes sharp, her lips firm. We see the widow, the queen, the mother of kings. But beneath the stiff lace collars and the severe gaze lies a truth more complex. Catherine was not simply a villain or a heroine. She was both. She was the orphan who endured, the wife who was humiliated, the widow who seized power, and the mother who carried her dynasty through fire and blood. Her life was never peaceful, her end never glorious, but her survival reshaped France. And though she left behind a reputation shrouded in contradiction, she also left a lesson, that in a world of wolves, sometimes silence, patience, and relentless will are the sharpest weapons of all.